Ms. Murray said, "Thank you, Your Honor." The government calls Paul Hinton. Your Honor. We understand that Mr. Kumraju is going to be handling the next witness. And we discussed with defense and we request maybe a 5 to 10 minute break before the next witness comes on.
The court said, "All righty."
Ms. Murray said, "And just for the record to discuss a stipulation that's relevant to Mr. Hinton's testimony."
The court said, "So you're seeking the break at this time?"
Ms. Murray said, "Not for the day."
The court said, "Not for the day. 10-minute break at this time."
Ms. Murray said, "Yes, thank you."
The court said, "Members of the jury will take a 10-minute break. Remember, you're not permitted to discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't."
Recess.
The court said, "Please have the jurors brought in."
Jury present.
The court said, "Please be seated, and you may call your witness again."
Ms. Murray said, "Thank you, Your Honor." The government calls Paul Hinton.
Witness sworn.
The court said, "Please state your name and spell it, and speak into the microphone."
The witness said, Paul Hinton. Paul Hinton.
The court said, "All right, sir, you're going to have to do better than that. I need for you to speak up."
The witness said, "I will."
The court said, "Good. Go ahead."
Ms. Murray said, "Thank you, Your Honor."
Paul Hinton, called as a witness by the government, having been duly sworn, testified as follows. Direct examination. By Ms. Murray.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hinton.
Good afternoon.
And if you could actually pull the microphone directly in front of you, that would help. The acoustics are not great. Could you please describe your educational background?
I have an undergraduate degree from Oxford University in England and a master's degree from Harvard Kennedy School of Government.
What subject matter is your undergraduate degree?
It's an engineering science degree.
And what is the subject matter of your master's degree?
It's a public policy degree that covers statistics, economics, and finance.
Are you currently employed?
I am.
Where do you work?
I work at the Brattle Group.
What is the Brattle Group?
The Brattle Group is an economic consulting firm that provides expert testimony in a range of settings, including litigation and arbitration.
How long have you been with the Brattle Group?
Over 10 years.
Mr. Hinton, if I refer to the Brattle Group as Brattle, will you understand what I'm referring to?
I will.
Where did you work prior to Brattle?
Prior to Brattle, I worked at another similar economic consulting firm for 18 years.
What is your title at Brattle?
I'm a principal.
What generally are your duties and responsibilities as a principal at Brattle?
Well, other than the professional development of staff, I lead projects where I'm either the expert who is going to testify or I'm supporting another expert who is going to testify.
Do you yourself conduct financial analysis in the course of your work at Brattle?
I do.
Have you testified in financial cases in the past?
I have.
Has that testimony been on both the defense side and on the side of the plaintiff or the government?
It has.
Has that testimony included expert testimony and summary witness testimony?
Yes.
And Mr. Hinton, did there come a time when the government contacted Brattle regarding this case?
Yes.
Around when was that?
It was around the March or the summer last year.
What, if anything, did the government ask Brattle to do with respect to this case?
At that time they said they expected to have a large volume of financial records that they wanted us to review and summarize.
Did the government in fact engage Brattle to provide litigative services on this case?
Yes.
During approximately what time period has Brattle conducted those services on this case?
Well, we officially started summer last year, but started working more intensively at the beginning of this year.
And is Brattle engaged with the government pursuant to a contract relating to its work on this case?
Yes.
What is the approximate dollar amount that Brattle has billed or will be paid for its work on this case?
About $2 million.
Does that include analysis that has been conducted prior to your testimony today?
Yes.
Does that also include bills for your testimony here today?
Yes.
Mr. Hinton. What was the scope of work of the project that the government engaged Brattle to do in this case?
Well, initially in the contract, there were some work streams that were contemplated that included looking at data from devices and, as I said, reviewing bank records, amongst other things.
Focusing in turn on some of the work that Brattle has done. Did there come a time when the government provided certain agreements and corporate documents to Brattle in this case?
It did.
Generally speaking, what type of agreements or documents were those?
They were a range of different types of documents. Many of them were service contracts. Others were documents indicating loan agreements or investment amounts.
In addition to those corporate agreements or documents, did the government provide Brattle with other types of records or exhibits in this case?
Yes, bank records.
And what approximate volume of bank records did the government provide to Brattle in this case?
Well, there were thousands of documents in the form of PDFs and Excel files representing over 200,000 transactions.
What, if anything, did the government engage Brattle to do with respect to those bank records?
Well, initially it was just to identify what the documents were that were in the production and which entities they related to and which bank accounts.
Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, if we could please pull up for the witness what's been marked for identification as Government Exhibit Z27. Mr. Hinton, do you recognize this exhibit?
Yes.
Did you review it in advance of your testimony?
I did.
Ms. Murray said, Your Honor, the government offers Government Exhibit Z27.
Mr. Kumraju said, No objection, Your Honor.
The court said, it is admitted.
Government's Exhibit Z27 received in evidence.
Ms. Murray said, if we could publish, please.
By Ms. Murray.
Mr. Hinton, can you describe for the jury what information is reflected on this page of Government Exhibit Z27? As it relates to Brattle's work with respect to the bank records in this case.
Yes. This just summarizes the volume of materials that we identified and then later the subset of those records that we processed to extract information.
And when you say processed accounts in the first column, what does that mean with respect to work that Brattle did?
Well, by processed, I mean we had to take each of these various bank documents that included financial transactions and extract the relevant transaction details from them and put them into an Excel spreadsheet.
Looking at the last row here, Mr. Hinton, number of banks. Approximately how many unique banks did the government provide records from in this case?
Well, we identified 72 different banks in the overall document production that we were sent.
For those 72 banks, the records from those banks, can you describe for the jury how, if at all, the format of the bank records differed?
Well, Some of the bank records were just ordinary bank statements that are very similar to the type of bank statement that any individual would have from their bank. And those would be PDFs. And they usually have the summary of the monthly activity at the top and then you show all the transactions and the balance. But there were a lot of other types of documents too. One other common format was a record of what's called wire transactions. And those are transactions that occur between banks, and those records could come in the form of, detailed statements that were PDFs, but they could also come in the form of a spreadsheet where there were many columns of data that described different features of each of the wire transfers. There were also, in some statements, images of checks. So just the cancelled checks or the checks after they had been processed and received at a bank. And there were other miscellaneous bank records also.
And looking again at the first column, processed accounts. Approximately how many files of bank documents did Brattle process in the course of its work on this case?
So over 2,000. So 2,173.
And looking at the next item there, number of entities. Those bank records were in the names of approximately how many different entities or individuals?
Well, there were about 119 different entities for whom we processed bank records.
And those 119 entities for the processed accounts, how many bank accounts did those represent?
There were 450 bank accounts for the 219 ISIC entities.
Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, if we could go to the next slide, please. Mr. Hinton, can you describe for the jury, first of all. Who provided the categories that are reflected on this slide?
The government.
And did the government inform or advise Brattle what entities to place within each of these categories?
Yes, they did.
And that was a determination made by the government, is that correct?
That's correct.
So looking here, and this is identified accounts. Can you just explain the difference between identified accounts and processed accounts?
Yes. Initially we received a large volume of documents, and we had to identify what those documents were, which entities were named in them, which banks, and which of them were actually documents that contained financial transaction information. So that was the identification phase. And the government later indicated which of those identified bank records they wanted us to process.
And reading across this slide, first of all, with respect to the rule of law category. Do you have any independent understanding of what the rule of law is?
No.
How many identified accounts were there for rule of law?
20.
Looking next, GTV/VOG. Do you have any independent knowledge of what GTV is?
No.
Or VOG?
No.
How many identified bank accounts were there that went into the government's category of GTV or VOG?
We identified 49.
And then farms, aside from the common understanding of the word. Do you know what farms means in the context of this case?
No.
Did the government provide that category and identify what entities or individuals fell within that category?
It did.
And how many identified bank accounts were there under the farms category?
85.
Looking now at G clubs and Crane, first, do you have any independent knowledge of G clubs?
No.
Do you have any independent knowledge of what Crane is?
No.
How many identified bank accounts fell within the government's category of G clubs or Crane?
82.
And finally, Mr. Hinton, Himalaya Exchange. Do you know what the Himalaya Exchange is?
No.
How many identified bank accounts fell within that category?
27.
Ms. Murray said, if we could go to the next slide, please, Ms. Loftus. Actually, let's go back one for a moment. Mr. Hinton. Can you explain the process by which Brattle extracted data from the bank records that the government provided?
Certainly. Well, there were two different processes, one for data that was already in a spreadsheet and a different process for the documents that came as PDFs. So the PDFs had to be OCR'd, so the optical character recognition run, so that the fields of information could be copied from those documents. And then computer programs were used to extract those fields of information and put them into a spreadsheet. So at that point we had all the records in spreadsheet form, and we then just had to organize the fields of information for each account so that they were formatted in a consistent way across all the banks and all the accounts.
Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, can we take this down, please, and let's put up for the witness-only Government Exhibit Z28. Mr. Hinton, do you recognize Exhibit Z28?
I do.
At a high level, what information does it reflect?
It lists all the banks down the left-hand side, and then in the columns, there's a count of the number of different bank accounts that we identified that are associated with each of the categories that were on the prior chart. I think there are also a couple of other categories on this particular chart. But the point here is that at DEM, it records the breakdown or the composition of all the bank accounts that we identified that were classified into all the categories the government gave us.
And Mr. Hinton, did you review Government Exhibit Z28 in advance of your testimony today?
I did.
Did you confirm that the information contained within this summary chart is accurate?
I did.
Ms. Murray said, Your Honor, the government offers Z28.
Mr. Kamraju said, no objection.
The court said, it is admitted.
Government's Exhibit Z28 received in evidence.
Ms. Murray said, could we please publish? All right. Mr. Hinton, now that the jury can see it, it's a bit small. We'll zoom in on various portions. Ms. Murray said, first, Ms. Loftus, if we could zoom in on the top portion. to include the first few rows but all of the column titles as well. So Mr. Hinton, looking across this document, the first few columns, those reflect the categories that we just saw on the prior slide, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And those are categories that the government defined and provided to Brattle?
It did.
Looking at the column titled ACA Capital, Hamilton, William J.E., what information, generally speaking, did the government define for that category?
It identified specific entities that should be categorized in that category. And those included entities ACA Capital and Hamilton.
And do you know who William J.E. is personally?
No.
Do you have any independent knowledge of ACA Capital or Hamilton?
No.
Looking at the next column, it's indicating family members with an asterisk. Do you see that?
I do.
And the final column, family offices with 2 asterisks. Do you see that?
Yes.
Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, if we could zoom out of this and go to the bottom, please, of this page. And zoom in on the bottom left portion. Mr. Hinton, for purposes of this summary chart, how is the family category defined? The government's family category?
It is defined to include all accounts for Mai Guo, Cheong Guo, William J.E., and Sin Ting Rong.
And do you know who any of those individuals is, Mr. Hinton, Mai Guo, Cheong Guo, William J.E., or Sin Ting Rong?
No.
And then family offices category that the government provided, Mr. Hinton. What entities is that defined to include?
The government told us to include the entities Lamp Capital, Golden Spring, Hudson Diamond, Lexington Property, and Greenwich Land.
And same question with respect to those entities. Do you have any understanding or knowledge of those entities?
No.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Let's zoom out again, Ms. Loftus. And if we could kind of zoom in on the top half of the chart or so. I just want to take a few examples here, Mr. Hinton. Looking, for example, at Bank of America, which is the second row. If you could just read across for the jury and read the number of identified accounts and the relevant category that those accounts fell under.
Yes. We identified bank account records for Bank of America accounts. For rule of law, there were 4. In the farms category, there were 11. In the GTV of VOG category, there were 4. There were 8 for family members. And that came to a total of 27.
Taking another example here, let's look at JPMC, or JP Morgan Chase. And read across the row the bank accounts that were identified for the various categories where there were accounts.
Yes. For JP Morgan Chase there were 25 farms accounts, 10 GTV VOG accounts, 5 G Clubs Crane accounts, and 5 family office accounts, for a total of 45 different accounts.
Ms. Murray said, let's zoom out of that, please, Ms. Loftus. And if we could zoom in now on the bottom portion of this. Down to the end. Taking just one more example, Mr. Hinton, Silvergate Bank, if you could read across there. Ms. Murray said, and Ms. Loftus, maybe we could scroll up for a moment for Mr. Hinton so he can see which column that is. There were 27 identified accounts in which category at Silvergate Bank?
It's the ACA Capital, Hamilton column that has 27 Silvergate Bank accounts.
And just looking at the totals here, Mr. Hinton. What was the total number of identified accounts for these various categories that are reflected on this chart?
422 different accounts.
Ms. Murray said, thank you, Ms. Loftus. We can take that down. Your Honor. At this time the government would like to offer various exhibits pursuant to stipulations between the parties. First, Ms. Loftus, if we could please pull up Stip 8, which is already admitted and in evidence. Pursuant to Stip 8, the government offers the following exhibits, which are reflected in parts of Column B. Government Exhibits GXBR 300, GXBR 356, GX 3200, GX 3202, GX 3210, GX 3213, GX 3214, GX 3204, GX 3207, GXBR 900, GXBR 931. GX 2001 GX 2717, and GXBR 1001 GXBR 1031. The government offers those exhibits pursuant to this stip.
Mr. Kamraju said, no objection.
The court said, they're admitted.
Government's exhibits BR 300 BR 356, 3200 to 3202, 3210 to 3213, 3214, 3204 to 3207, BR 900 BR 931, 2001 to 2717, BR 1001 BR 1031 received in evidence.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Ms. Loftus, if you could please now pull up GX Stip 14. Again. This is a stipulation between the parties that has been admitted. Your Honor. In the interest of time and everyone's attention, I'll just reference the government exhibits that are cited in this stipulation and offer them pursuant to the stipulation. This stipulation indicates that the parties have agreed that the government exhibits listed in column B were lawfully obtained by the government. They're authentic records of the entity listed in column A, they were made at or near the time by, or information transmitted by a person with knowledge, they were kept in the regular course. And it was the regular practice of the entity to make the records. The government exhibits listed in column B are bank records from producing parties that are banks. Pursuant to this stipulation, the government offers all of the government exhibits listed in column B.
The court said, they're admitted.
Government's exhibits column B of Stip 14 received in evidence.
Ms. Murray said, finally, Your Honor, the government would offer at this time government exhibit Stip 22 for admission.
The court said, it is admitted.
Government's exhibit Stip 22 received in evidence.
Ms. Murray said, and pursuant to government exhibit Stip 22, the government offers the following additional bank records. Government exhibit Stip 22 is a stipulation between the parties agreeing that the government exhibits cited in column B are records maintained in the course of the regular business of the entities listed in column A, which are banks that are producing parties. Pursuant to government exhibit Stip 22, the government offers all of the government exhibits cited in column B of Stip 22.
The court said, they are admitted.
Government's exhibits column B of Stip 22 received in evidence.
Ms. Murray said, thank you. We can take that down, Ms. Loftus. So if we could go back now, please, to GXZ 27. And let's go to slide 3.
By Ms. Murray.
Mr. Hinton, can you describe for the jury what is reflected on this summary chart?
This chart lists the names of the entities that were classified as family office entities and the number of processed bank accounts for each.
And to be clear, the processed bank accounts. Is it correct that those are accounts that Brattle extracted the data from?
That's correct.
Bank records?
That's correct.
All right. And we could go, actually, let's look at this for a moment. How many processed bank accounts were there for Lamp Capital, LLC?
25.
What about for Greenwich Land, LLC?
3.
So in total for these 5 family office entities under the government's category, how many processed bank accounts were there?
52.
Ms. Murray said, let's go to the next slide, please, Ms. Loftus. And if we could scroll up a bit. And just zoom so we can see the full summary chart. Mr. Hinton, generally speaking, what information is reflected on this slide?
This is a similar chart that lists all the processed accounts for the individual entities that were categorized in the farm group.
And those were categories that the government provided, is that correct?
That is correct.
And is it correct that this summary chart lists only processed accounts for the farm entities that are listed here?
Yes, just those for which we extracted data.
Ms. Murray said, if we could scroll down a bit, Ms. Loftus. For those farm accounts for which Brattle extracted data, how many accounts were there?
55.
And looking at the 4th row here, what is the name of that farm entity?
Maywin Trading, LLC.
Ms. Murray said, we can take that down, Ms. Loftus. Now, Mr. Hinton, you mentioned that in addition to bank accounts, Brattle also received loan agreements and other documents from the government, is that correct?
That's correct.
Did the government ask Brattle to conduct a certain analysis of some of those agreements?
It did.
Did that include a summary analysis of Maywin Trading, LLC loan agreements?
It did.
Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, if we could please go to Government Exhibit Z29, just for the witness for the moment. Mr. Hinton, do you recognize Z29?
I do.
At a high level, what is it?
It's the first page of a long list of all of the loan agreements that we identified for Maywin Trading, LLC, which was, and it's labeled here Phoenix Farm.
And did you review this exhibit in advance of your testimony today?
I did.
Is the information in Z29 accurate?
It is.
Ms. Murray said, Your Honor, the government offers Government Exhibit Z29.
Mr. Kamraju said, no objection.
The court said, it is admitted.
Government's Exhibit Z29 received in evidence.
Ms. Murray said, Can we please publish, Ms. Loftus?
By Ms. Murray.
Can you read the title, now that the jury can see it, of this exhibit, please, Mr. Hinton?
It says Phoenix Farm, and in brackets it says Maywin Trading LLC, loan agreements.
Do you know what the Phoenix Farm is, Mr. Hinton?
I do not.
Now looking at this summary chart that's contained within this exhibit, the farthest right column. What information is reflected there under the column titled GX?
Those were all the government exhibit numbers that correspond to the loan agreements.
Ms. Murray said, If we could focus on the top portion, Ms. Loftus, before the table. Mr. Hinton, how many Maywin Trading LLC or Phoenix Farm loan agreements did Brattle identify in the materials the government provided?
We identified 686 distinct loan agreements.
Did Brattle evaluate or analyze those loan agreements to determine whether they were signed?
We did.
How many of those 686 loan agreements were signed by the borrower, or the Phoenix Farm, Maywin Trading LLC?
None of them had a signature for the borrower.
And how many of those 686 loan agreements were signed by the lender? Or the individuals who were the counterparties to those agreements?
They were all signed.
Ms. Murray said, All right. If we could zoom out of that, I just want to look at one or two examples, if we please. Could. Ms. Loftus, let's go down, please, to, thank you. Actually, let's go one more page down. And, perfect. So looking at one of the entries for December 3, 2020, Mr. Hinton. Do you see that the amount is listed as not applicable on this summary chart?
There are some entries that say NA, that's correct.
Ms. Murray said, If we could go to that source exhibit, Ms. Loftus. So this is December 3, 2020. That's Government Exhibit 2502. Which is in evidence. If we could focus on the top portion here, Ms. Loftus. Mr. Hinton, what is listed for the borrower on this loan agreement?
It says Phoenix Farm, and in brackets it says Maywin Trading, LLC.
And who is listed as the lender?
The lender is listed as CAI Yanting. Excuse my pronunciation.
There's a certain field that's called Lender's Phoenix Farm Code. Do you see that?
Yes.
What information is reflected there?
It's just an alphanumeric code.
And can you read that, please?
FH1-1560.
And this loan agreement is dated. What is the date?
It's dated December 3, 2020.
Under Section 1, Terms, can you read, A, Use of Proceeds?
It says, The loan proceeds advanced under this agreement is for the general working capital purposes of the borrower.
Looking at item, B, loan amount. What loan amount is reflected on this agreement?
Well, there's a little blank space in the sentence that is empty in this particular agreement.
What is the interest rate that's reflected here under 1C?
3% per annum.
Payable when?
It is payable in full on the final maturity date.
And then, D, final maturity date. What's reflected there?
The final maturity date is 36 months after the effective date.
Ms. Murray said, if we could zoom out of this, please, Ms. Loftus. And let's go down a few pages. So there are initials on the bottom, Mr. Hinton. Do you see that? Oh.
I see that there are some typed, 3 letters are typed at the bottom of each page, which appear to be, well, the first 2 of which match the first name and the last name of the lender.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Let's keep going through the next few pages, please, Ms. Loftus. On this page, Mr. Hinton, does it appear that this document is signed?
Yeah, in the signature area of the agreement, there are some Chinese characters.
And that's for which party to this agreement?
It's for CAI Yanting, who is the lender.
Is there a signature on the line that is associated with Phoenix Farm, Maywin Trading, LLC?
No. The line is blank.
And Mr. Hinton, this is signed even though there's no loan amount listed, is that correct?
That's correct.
Ms. Murray said, if we can go back, Ms. Loftus, to Government Exhibit Z29. Thank you. And if we could go to the last page. Please. Mr. Hinton, for the 686 Phoenix Farm loan agreements that are reflected in this summary chart, what is the cumulative dollar amount associated with those loan agreements?
The sum of the loan amounts for these agreements is $23,158,757.
Ms. Murray said, thank you, Ms. Loftus. We can take that down now. Mr. Hinton, since the government engaged Brattle in connection with this case, has the government provided guidance to Brattle regarding the analysis that it was requesting?
Yes, it has.
Did that include calls and meetings to discuss Brattle's findings and to provide, for example, categories of information for Brattle to characterize certain records?
It did.
Did the government provide edits or other feedback to Brattle regarding its analysis and findings?
It did.
Does Brattle's work product, including the exhibits we've looked at so far today, reflect certain of the government's feedback and instruction?
They do.
Now, Mr. Hinton, besides the analysis you've been describing that Brattle performed in this case, your testimony today, and your preparation for that testimony, did you have any involvement in this case?
I did.
What was the degree of your involvement in this case, besides the analysis you described? Your testimony today, and your preparation for that testimony?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. What was your involvement in this case besides the analysis that Brattle performed? Your testimony today, and your preparation for the testimony?
Well, those are the elements of my work. I supervised the staff to perform the analysis I prepared for testimony. And I'm delivering the testimony today. That was the scope of our engagement.
And Mr. Hinton, did you review all of the evidence that the government has collected in this case, or did you just review the records and exhibits that the government provided to Brattle?
Only the documents that were provided to Brattle.
Did Brattle have any role in determining what exhibits or records the government would provide to Brattle?
No.
And you mentioned the process of extracting data from the bank records that the government provided. How, if at all, did Brattle catalog or categorize that extracted data?
Well, we used the categorizations that we discussed earlier to identify not just the bank accounts but the individual transactions based on which entities were involved and what category they were in. And then, as I've mentioned before, we took the transaction data from each of the different sources and organized them into a single database so that they could be looked at together.
And what was your role, if any, with respect to that database that contained the extracted bank record data?
Well, I designed the database structure and I supervised and directed the work along the way to populate it.
At a high level, can you describe for the jury how that database operated?
Well, it's a more secure way of organizing the hundreds of different bank account records, sets of records, than just keeping them in a spreadsheet. So it enabled us to organize all the different banks' transaction records in the same format and also capture the categories that the government had given us and associate it with every single transaction along with the reference numbers telling us which document they came from.
And when you say the reference numbers reflecting the document, Did those documents link to identified government exhibits in this case?
Yes, that means that every single transaction, of which there are over 200,000 in the database, can be linked back to a source document that is a GX, has a GX number in this case.
And in preparing for your testimony today, Mr. Hinton, did you review and verify the accuracy of the various summary charts we've looked at so far?
I did.
And did you do that in part by going to the database that Brattle maintained of bank records?
Yes. In fact, the individual transactions represented on each chart were taken from the database. And I was able to then identify which government exhibit the data came from and look at the underlying source document to verify the data.
Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, can we please put up what's been marked for identification as Government Exhibit Z26? And that's just for the witness. And if we could scroll through a few pages. Mr. Hinton, do you recognize Z26?
I do.
Did you assist in preparing Government Exhibit Z26?
I did.
Does Z26 contain a summary of certain bank records that Brattle reviewed in connection with this case?
Yes, reviewed and processed.
Ms. Murray said, and if we could go to the last page, please, Ms. Loftus. Looking at the last page of this presentation. Does this reflect the government exhibits that are the source documents that support the data contained within Z26?
Yes.
Have you reviewed the information in Z26 and the source documents cited on this slide, Mr. Hinton?
I have.
Have you confirmed the information is accurate?
I have.
Ms. Murray said, Your Honor, the government offers Government Exhibit Z26.
Mr. Kamraju said, no objection.
The court said, it is admitted.
Government's Exhibit Z26 received in evidence.
Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, if we could go to the first slide, please, and publish to the jury.
By Ms. Murray.
Mr. Hinton, what is the title of Government Exhibit Z26?
Bank record summaries.
Excellent. Ms. Murray said, let's go to the next slide, please. What information, generally, is reflected on this chart, Mr. Hinton?
Well, this is the result of summing up the value of all the transactions in the database. So that's all the transactions we processed and categorized according to the categories that the government gave us for GTV, farms, G clubs, and Himalaya.
And the top of this chart, Mr. Hinton, says sources of funds. Did the government provide Brattle with instruction regarding how and whether to categorize certain transactions as sources of funds?
It did.
Focusing on, for example, G clubs. What was some of the instruction that the government provided to Brattle regarding what type of transactions should be tagged or categorized as sources of funds that flow through to G clubs?
So these are transactions that come from individuals, not from entities. And only those individuals who aren't associated with, in some way with any of the entities that are listed on the chart.
What, if anything, did the government direct Brattle with respect to the dollar amounts of transactions that should be included within G Club's sources of funds?
So for certain accounts we observed there were amounts in round numbers of 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 and 50,000. And the government instructed us that any transactions for those amounts, plus or minus $100, from individuals should be classified, or even if they weren't from identified individuals, those amounts should be classified as sources of funds.
Did the government explain to you why it instructed Brattle to tag transactions in those amounts as sources of funds for G clubs?
No.
Do you have any independent understanding why the government gave that instruction?
No.
What discretion, if any, did Brattle have in deviating from the government's definition of sources of funds for purposes of this summary analysis?
We did not have any discretion.
Reading along the amounts here. What is the sum dollar amount reflected in this summary exhibit of sources of funds that flowed through to the government's category of GTV or VOG?
$411 million.
What about the farms?
$110 million.
And what amount went through to G clubs?
$240 million.
And finally, what amount went through to the Himalaya exchange?
$517 million.
And that's for a combined total of what amount, as reflected here for purposes of this summary?
$1.3 billion.
Ms. Murray said, and Ms. Loftus, we can go to the next slide. Looking at the top of this, Mr. Hinton, what is the title of this slide?
The title is GTV of VOG, Overview.
And is that one of the categories that the government defined for Brattle?
Yes.
Looking at the sources of funds here, there are 3 entities listed, kind of at the bottom of the slide. Do you see those?
I do.
Under those entities, there are parentheticals and there are some letters and numbers. What information, if any, does that reflect?
The numbers and letters represent particular bank accounts.
And so the letters, what about the bank accounts do the letters reflect?
So the letters are just an acronym or shorthand for the name of the bank. So BOA stands for Bank of America.
And then the numbers that are listed throughout these slides for different bank accounts, what portion, if any, of the relevant account number are those?
Those are the last 4 digits of the bank account number.
So looking at this overview slide, how much money from the sources of funds that were identified went to Voice of Gwm Media Incorporated between April 20, 2020 and October 13, 2020?
$72.9 million went into the Bank of America and Wells Fargo Bank, Voice of Gwm Media accounts on this chart.
And looking in the middle, how much went into those 2 JP Morgan accounts held in the name of Soraka Media Group Incorporated?
$286.9 million.
And on the right, how much went into the Capital One and the JP Morgan Bank accounts held in the name of GTV Media Group Incorporated?
$29.6 million.
And over what time period did that $29.6 million go into the GTV Media Group, Inc.'s bank account?
Between May 11, 2020 and June 12, 2020, that those amounts went into the 2 bank accounts shown there.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Ms. Loftus, the next slide, please. Mr. Hinton, what is the title of this slide?
This slide is titled GTV of VOG, Select Flows.
Generally speaking, at a high level, what does this summary chart or summary slide reflect?
It shows the aggregate dollar amount of flows of funds between particular bank accounts over certain time periods.
And Mr. Hinton, who selected which bank account to include on this summary flow slide?
The government.
If we could just follow through a few examples. Looking at the second arrow on the top left from sources of funds going to the Wells Fargo bank account in the name of Voice of Gwm Media Inc., what is the dollar amount that goes to that account from sources of funds?
$46.3 million.
And then looking at the next select flow from that account. Where does $15 million in the form of a cashier check go from that account?
It goes from Wells Fargo to JP Morgan at Soraka Media Group.
And from that JP Morgan account ending in 5601, where then do we see a flow of $125.5 million going?
To Soraka Media Group at JP Morgan 2038.
And over what time period?
From June 3 to June 10.
Of what year?
2020.
And then let's look at the outflows from that Soraka Media Group Incorporated account, the JP Morgan 2038. First, on the left, what do we see going straight down on June 5, 2020?
There's a transfer of $100 million on June 5 to Heyman Hong Kong Opportunities Fund.
Mr. Hinton, do you know what the Heyman Hong Kong Opportunities Fund is?
I do not.
All right. And then let's look at another outflow from that JP Morgan 2038 account. Going to the right on June 9 of 2020. What amount do we see listed there?
$38 million on June 9, 2020.
Now looking down the center of this slide, Mr. Hinton, just briefly. Can you follow through the sources of funds that go down the center of the slide directly to the Soraka Media JP Morgan account ending in 5601 and then on through to the GTV Media account at Citibank ending in 6691?
Yes. Starting in February on the 22nd of 2019 over the following year and a half or so. There's $275.9 million in funds from sources of funds as they've so been defined. Into Soraka Media Group's JP Morgan account ending in 5601. Then on June 3, 2006, there's a 200 million transfer from that Saraka Media Group account to GTV Media Group at Sita Group account 6691.
And just to be clear, Mr. Hinton, what year was that? The June 3rd transaction of 200 million from Saraka at JP Morgan to GTV at Citi?
In 2020.
If we can go to the next, actually, stay on this slide for a moment, please. Looking at the far right. Mr. Hinton, do you see a name that's in the far right bottom box? There's a company name and a PNC.
I do.
What is that name?
Lowell and Mitchell.
Do you know what Lowell and Mitchell is?
I know that it's a law firm.
The court said, all righty. We need to stop because it's 5 o'clock. Members of the jury, don't discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Don't permit anyone to discuss the case in your presence. Don't read, watch, or listen to anything from any source having to do with the subject matter of this trial. Have a good evening.
Jury not present.
The court said, sir, you may step out.
The witness said, okay, thank you.
The court said, don't discuss your testimony.
The witness said, I will not. Witness not present.
The court said, you may be seated. Is there anything further before we break?
Mr. Kamraju said, not from the defense, Your Honor.
Mr. Finkel said, just a scheduling update from the government. After Mr. Hinton, the government believes it has 2 witnesses left. After those 2 witnesses, the government would like to play a handful of videos or show a few documents that the jury has not yet seen but are already in evidence. And I just want to make sure that's okay with the court, that we don't have a witness on the stand for that.
The court said, if they're in evidence, that's fine.
Mr. Finkel said, okay. We'll plan to do that. Just for the court's knowledge and for defense counsel's knowledge. After Mr. Hinton, who approximately has 30 to 45 minutes left on direct, the direct of the 2 remaining witnesses. One is probably just north of an hour, and then the last witness we would estimate as around 90 minutes. Depending on how quick the technology moves. It's mostly cell phone extractions, text messages, things like that. So that's sort of where the government is in its case. I just wanted the court to be aware of that. So we expect to rest tomorrow, assuming crosses are not voluminous. Outside of that, Your Honor, absent any questions. The government is just inquiring about the week of July 8th. With the understanding now we're sitting full days on July 2nd and 3rd on July 8th. If things move at the clip that the defense has predicted, and the government certainly hopes, I think we'll be in jury addresses and deliberations. Is the court planning to sit a full day for, I know for deliberations, Your Honor said it would. Is the same for jury deliberations? In other words, sorry. I apologize. I'm a little tired. Is the week of July 8th going to be a full 9 to 5 week as well?
The court said, so for summations and deliberations we will sit a full day.
Mr. Finkel said, okay. That's helpful. Thank you, Your Honor.
The court said, have a good evening.
Mr. Kamraju said, you too, Your Honor.
Ms. Murray said, thank you, Your Honor.
Adjourned to June 26, 2024, at 9 a.m. Permit anyone to discuss the case in your presence. Don't read, watch, or listen to anything that touches on the subject of this case.
The law clerk said, jury exiting.
Recess.